in my reading of the New Testament dignifies the blackness of this man's skin. God claims this man, in my reading of it, God claims this man because he's black, not in spite of the fact that he's black. And his blackness is important to God because God made him black man. And so
watching another episode of the Jude 3 Project podcast. As always, I'm your host, Lisa Fields, the founder of the Jude 3 Project. And today I'm joined by another special guest, soon to be Dr. Marcus Jerkins. Welcome, Marcus.
thank you so much, Lisa, for having me.
Thank you for agreeing to be on the podcast. I'm excited about what we're going to talk about today. But before we get into that, can you give our audience just a little bit of background about who you are?
Sure. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. I went to Emory University for my Bachelor's of Arts degree, my Master of Divinity degree, my Master of Theology degree, and now I'm doing my PhD in New Testament Studies at Baylor University. And I am a servant of the Lord Jesus Christ. I've been a preacher for the vast majority of my life, but now God has me as a preacher, also functioning as a scholar. And so I've been doing this work in biblical studies and hoping to use this research that I'm doing for the sake of the gospel.
Awesome. And I just wanted to get you on the podcast after we talked about your dissertation on the Black presence in the Bible, which is so critical to the work we're doing here at the Jude 3 Project. Tell us about what your dissertation is, like just the thesis, and why was it important for you to study that topic?
So when I applied to Baylor, not many years ago, I guess, almost 5 years ago now. At the time, I had written a paper when I was doing my Master of Theology on Luke chapter 10 and the fall of Satan. Jesus talks about, I saw Satan as lightning fall from heaven. And I noticed that there was something interesting going on in Luke's gospel regarding the fall of Satan and the rise of the people of God. And that language, you can see that language in Luke chapter 10 about Satan's fall and the people of God's name, their names are written in heaven. And I wanted to further explore that concept. What does it mean for God's people to have their names written in heaven? And I noticed something interesting in Luke, that Luke, as a synoptic gospel, does something that Matthew and Mark do not do. Luke tries to emphasize the fact that God's people are God's children. That son is, in fact, in the Greek is huios. The Greek word huios means son. And that language features more prominently in Luke's gospel than it does in Mark and Matthew. In particular, the resurrection argument that Jesus has with the Sadducees in both Matthew and Mark is extended. That narrative is extended in Luke. Luke adds language where Matthew and Mark does not have that, and that it says that those who are worthy to be part of the resurrection, he says they do so because they are the sons of the resurrection. They are the sons of God, and I caught hold to that, and I connected that to the earlier idea I had about the rise of God's people, and I was wondering, given because I read this quote from Du Bois recently, but this was the mindset I had back then. I was wondering if there was a way I could engage my scholarship to the culture and something that's relevant to me and my own experience. And I found that particular idea about the rise of God's people, God's exaltation of human beings. And in the resurrection, Luke says, and other gospels say this, the other gospels say you'll be as the angels. Luke says you'll be equal to the angel, Isa angeloi. You'll be equal to the angels. And I was wondering, how might we understand kind of the taxonomy of human identity, and how human beings relate to angels and then really relate to God? How does exaltation work? And how might that have an impact on how we understand ourselves as people? And so this is what in a lot of New Testament scholarship, and not just New Testament scholarship, but in in scholarly communities writ large, we call anthropology, right? So we have, it's not, what other scholars have done, cultural biology, cultural anthropologists and biological anthropologists, but this is theological anthropology. And I was interested in what that meant from a scriptural point of view, especially given Luke's emphasis on the exaltation of people to be God's children. And I stumbled upon just, reading through Luke, and I saw this son language, and I was wondering, what might this mean in the context of how the gospel is preached in the book of Acts? And I wanted to figure out, okay, well, when we look at the exaltation of human beings when it comes to Israel, that makes, you get that, okay, God's reclaiming his people, these are God's children. You get that language all throughout the Old Testament. The sons of the children, these are the children of God. But what about non-Jews? And again, trying to make this relevant for my own people, my eyes ran straight towards the first Gentile convert in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 8, and that's the Ethiopian eunuch. And I wondered what was the relationship between Luke's gospel, the exaltation of human beings, and then Acts chapter 8, and if there was anything else going on there. And when I started doing research on this issue, I discovered that one of the things that's ignored, especially amongst current scholars, modern scholars, and even some ancient writers, is the fact that the emphasis of that text is on the fact that this is a Black man who is claimed by God. And I found that to be interesting, especially, again, trying to see relevance here. Looking at W.B. Du Bois and others who said that my scholarship has to be able to impact my culture. I saw it wasn't just me trying to tailor the situation to my situation, but the text itself spoke to my situation even before I saw it. That the Bible in Acts chapter 8 was trying to emphasize that God, in God's willingness to save and reclaim the world and to claim the nations for himself, God first reached out to a Black person and emphasized the fact that this person was Black. And that's why it's important, because it could have said an Egyptian, or someone else. It could have been, God could have arranged anyone, but it's an Ethiopian. And in the ancient world, this is important, in the ancient world, to speak of Ethiopia or to speak of an Ethiopian is to automatically mean that you're speaking of a Black-skinned person. And for me, that was important because, and this, it's not much has to be said on this. In our culture, in American culture, and many other places around the world, being Black skinned or being, darker skinned is a curse. Is seen to be a problem. And yet, when God desired to start the Gentile mission, when God desired to claim the nations for God's self, God reached out to Black-skinned people first, a Black-skinned person first. And I wanted to understand why in Luke's historiography, and why in Luke's reading of the beginning of the church, why he even included this story. What were the larger theological implications? And it took me also to Acts chapter 13 with Simeon, who is called the Latin word niger, but Simeon, which one can translate as Simeon the Black man, who is who appears to be, given his co-location with Lucius of Cyrene, appears to be another Cyrenian or a person from Libya. And so there's something there. I'm sure you all have talked about this before. Thomas Oden does a lot of work on early African Christianity, and he does a lot of work on Libyan Christianity in particular, and the African memory of Mark and so forth. So my dissertation has been growing from that particular perspective. In fact, I was privileged to have the opportunity to give a paper, I think a week ago, at the regional Southwestern Religious Commission, and in the SBL portion, the Society of Biblical Literature portion, where I gave a paper on um, uh, a Greek novel called The Ethiopian Story, or An Ethiopian Story, and it deals with uh, blackness, the blackness of Ethiopian skin, and in particular something interesting, a white Ethiopian, which is something that's strange in the ancient world. And so it was important for me in that paper to try to bring up how the New Testament contrasts with the story, in that in my reading of the New Testament dignifies the blackness of this man's skin. God claims this man, in my reading of it, God claims this man because he's black, not in spite of the fact that he's black. And his blackness is important to God because God made him black man. And so uh, my argument in my dissertation is going to be about the exaltation of black skin as something that's important to God. And because, and in part because, and we'll talk about this if you want to ask me further about this, in part because, Lisa, uh, in the ancient world, black skin was a problem to many. And so for God allowed his writers to set the record straight to say blackness is not a problem. Black skin is not a problem. Being brown skin is not a problem, but it's something that God gave, and it's beautiful, and it's something that God says is in his image just as much as any other color.
Mm-hmm. And I love that you led to my next question. How did the ancient world view darker skinned people? I know modern racism is a kind of a modern construct, but there was still some prejudices and some challenges with the view of black skinned people in that day, even before they titled it what we have in our modern construct, especially in the West.
Sure. Yeah, and that's one of the interesting things about it. So it depends on what you have people like. So let's start with Homer. So Homer discusses two kinds of Ethiopians, right? So let's before we even do that, let's talk about the word Ethiopian itself, right? Ethiopian is an adaptation of the Greek word itho and ops. There's a contraction. Itho means burn or to burn, and ops means face. So Ethiopian means burnt face. So when people were talking about Ethiopians, they were talking about people whom they considered to be people who are burned by sun. And we even say that about ourselves, right? We say we are people who are kissed by nature's sun. Um, and so this is where the word itself comes from. And so you have someone like Homer, who's ancient writer, ancient Greek writer, one of the kind of the foundations for the Greek philosophy, poetry, and so forth. Who says that you have two kinds of Ethiopians? You have Ethiopians in the south, and you have Ethiopians in the east. Ethiopians in the south were the ones who are in what we call Nubia, and the ones in the east are people in India, right? So you have black skinned people over there and black skinned people in Africa. And he said that there were the ones in Africa were the ones that Zeus and Poseidon both had dinner with them. So it's an interesting concept. He called them incomparable. You have also someone like Diodorus, who's around first century BC. Diodorus would describe Ethiopians as people who have customs that are pretty much beneath civilized Hellenistic society. These people, he said, they have shrill voices. He said they had they ran around like wild animals, and they had black skin and woolly hair. When he associates these things, excuse me, with associates their phenotype, their skin color, so forth, with their behavior, right? How they look, kind of tells us about how they behave, and this is linked to what we call physiognomy. So physiognomy is using someone's appearance to say something about their character, and that's what racism essentially is, right? So you have more more on the side of benign forms of physiognomy in the ancient world. You didn't have chattel slavery like we have, you know, in the modern period, but that's the foundation, right? So Rodney Sadler, whom you had on the panel, Dr. Sadler argues that in the ancient world you have what he calls racialism rather than racism. But you have, and I would agree with him in that regard. But I would press a little bit more because you do have some outright forms of racism. Because in the ancient world, people were a little bit looser with how they categorize people, and so they thought, you know, if your nose was too long, that meant that you were, if you had a eagle-looking nose, that meant that you were noble, you like an eagle, right? So it's called zoological physiognomy, right? And you have ethnographic physiognomy, you know, different kinds of ways people in the ancient world understood how, you know, appearance would reflect character. And so, in particular, this in the ancient world, you have all these different ideas, and one more person bears mentioning is a guy named Philo who follows pseudo Aristotle. Pseudo Aristotle said if you're too black, something is wrong with you. If you're too white, something is wrong with you. And pseudo Aristotle uses these same kinds of judgments, and says that that people who are black, in fact, you know, Philo of Alexandria, Jewish writer from around actually near contemporary with Jesus, pseudo Philo, oh, I'm sorry, not pseudo Philo, but Philo of Alexandria says in his analysis of the book of Genesis, if you read Genesis 1, it's very interesting. Genesis 1 talks about where the Garden of Eden is located. And you'll notice that one of the rivers that flows around the Garden of Eden flows also, the Bible says, into Cush, right? The Hebrew word for Ethiopia, or what we call Ethiopia. Oh, Ethiopia is what ends up getting translated in the Septuagint for Cush almost everywhere. But anyway, so this river flows in. So anyway, Philo, in his commentary on the book of Genesis, talks about this river. And he says, and it's something interesting, he says that the river flows into Ethiopia because the river is there to give courage, because he says Ethiopia means humiliation, right? And so he's following here pseudo Aristotle, who says that to be too black means to be humiliated or to be coward. He says the Greek word deloi. He says you're cowardly. So, but he uses that same concept and says that to be too black or to be Ethiopian and to be burnt faced is to be humiliated. And this is what's important. This is one of the arguments I'm making in my dissertation. Something that I've been puzzled as to why I've not seen commentaries on the Book of Acts deal with this particular issue, or in other writers who deal with the Ethiopian eunuch narrative. I've not seen this dealt with. That the scripture that the Ethiopian is reading deals with the servant song, the part where he talks about the humiliation of the servant. And for an ancient reader who's reading about an Ethiopian, knowing possibly about what Philo would have said and what other writers would have said about Ethiopians and being cowardly because of how they look and humiliated because of how they look, it's interesting that the reader would pick up on the fact, I believe, that this Ethiopian is reading a text that should connect with him, in that it should indict him because he's supposed to be humiliated. But the point of the text is to say that you are not humiliated because of how you look, that your blackness is not at all a sign of humiliation, because the servant of the Lord, the one who was crucified, he himself was humiliated. So the argument I believe that Luke is trying to give us through history is to show us that the Ethiopian eunuch, in his coming to the Lord, is being identified with by Jesus himself. That Jesus himself identifies with this man's blackness in his humiliation. And I think that's profound. I think that's powerful. And that shows me that Luke is very particular in saying that God wanted, when he wanted to save the world, the first people he wanted to reach was black folk. And that says something to me. That says that it means something, and it may explain. And this is me stepping out of my scholarly shoes and over to my my preacher shoes. This says something to me about why history is the way it is, and why God, I believe, is using African people, the sons and daughters of Africa, in the way He's used us to show the world that what oppression really is, and what the nature of evil really is, and uses us as beacons of His gospel to share with others about the profundity of it. I believe that the scriptures themselves are meant to show us that God desires African sons and daughters. And from the beginning, God was always intentional about this. This was no accident. And unlike much scholarship, Lisa, that we have today, this was not something that it's not a throwaway passage. A lot of people, I mean, I'm not sure if you've heard this, but a lot of scholars think this particular passage is a throwaway passage about the Ethiopian eunuch. They say there's no point in Luke's gospel. This doesn't connect to the gospel, and there's no overall point for the book of Acts. But I think it's absolutely important, and it shows us God's intentionality towards rescuing black skinned people.
And I think it also speaks to the validity of the New Testament. Because if the nature of people was to look down upon darker skinned folk, and if there was European influence in the translation of scripture, it would seem to me that that wouldn't be included,
Yeah.
because it empowers those of us that are sun kissed, that our melanin is popping. It empowers us because God used. We were the first
Yeah.
to be converted as Gentiles, and also I think it challenges a narrative that um, it kind of undermines some of the Hebrew Israelite rhetoric we hear about conversion, blackness, and Jewish nature. So it's a very, I think, important text and packed with things that we can use as Black people dealing with challenges today.
Yeah, 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 and yeah. So, just to say this, just for because I know someone watching this might say, well, the Book of Acts chapter 15 says that Cornelius, they were the first. Uh, uh, what Acts shows us, I believe, and this is what's interesting. It's clear that Cornelius was not the first, because Craig Keener argues that the Ethiopian eunuch narrative is given the privilege of chronology, that the Ethiopian eunuch is the first group of people to be converted came from Cornelius and his church, the church that, well, the group of people that met in his house. But what's clear, I think, is that Luke wants us to see that God began the mission with the Ethiopian eunuch, and Luke is very clear that he's going back home. And so we know that the oldest Christian denomination in the world is from Ethiopia, right? Had to start somewhere. And I think Luke is trying to alert us that God began his work trying to get people in the South, the black skinned folks, get those people right. And the point, and this really, I want to make sure I say this. The point of that is to say, one, he's subverting conceptions in that culture about the irrelevance of these people. That's one thing. Second, he's also saying, because you think these people are irrelevant, because you marginalize these people and you think them to not be important to me, when I reach them, I'm showing you I'm going to reach everybody. And because in the ancient world, right, and this is why grace is such an interesting concept. In the ancient world, you don't give things to people who can't give stuff back to you, right? You don't help people who can't help you back, right? And so the point of the gospel is to say God reaches those who can't pay him back, which shows that he's going to get everybody. Because if they can't help God, he's certainly going to get people who, so that's the point, is that these people, in many, by not everybody, but there were many people in the ancient world who thought that African people were a lower people just by virtue of the fact that they were black skinned. And so the opposite end of valorizing them was to demonize them and to associate them with darkness and night and evil, and because of the color of their skin. And the gospel says no. In the gospel, we understand that Jesus died for everybody. Jesus dies to rescue all of the shades of Adam, all of God's people, who came from God. God wants to reclaim all of them, and the black skinned people he starts with first because they are essential to his plan.
Mm-hmm. That's definitely helpful. When we think about Simon of Cyrene,
Sure,
um, and the black presence in the Bible,
sure,
would you classify him as a part of that coalition of the black presence
sure,
in the Bible?
sure. That's an interesting point. I mean, so there's a lot of debate about that, and I'm probably going to end up arguing that Simon of Cyrene is black. There's some arguments to. I mean, there's some credibility to arguing that he wasn't, necessarily, black as maybe me, I am, but I'm pretty sure he was a brown skinned. If he were Jew, so a possibility he could have been a Jew, right? He could have been a Jewish, because there were many Jews all throughout North Africa and even all the way down to Ethiopia, so definitely in Egypt. So there were Jews all throughout Africa, in that area, not all throughout, not Western Africa, but in the North Africa and so forth. Uh, so that's certainly possible that he could have been a Jew. But I'm
Before
leaning.
you go further, I want to make sure that our audience knows who Simon of Cyrene is.
Sure,
Uh,
sure.
Simon of Cyrene is the one who assisted Jesus uh, on his way to be crucified.
Thank you. Yes. So Simon Simon and then also has two sons. That Mark tells us that he was the father of Alexander and Rufus, and Paul actually makes mention of one of them, one or both of them. I can't remember at this point, but one or both of these brothers. And so I think that's essential. So it's possible that Simon was just a Jew, a brown skinned Jew. We know he was. Here's the point: he wasn't European. He was Jewish, either Jewish or he could have been certainly a black proselyte, which I believe Lucius of Cyrene was. I believe the Ethiopian eunuch was a proselyte, black skinned proselyte, and I believe certainly Simeon Niger was a proselyte. And Acts chapter 13 is important. Acts chapter 13 gives us the list of people who pray for Paul and Barnabas and send them out on the mission. And I believe two black skinned men were a part of that group in Antioch, which shows us that, and we know there were, here's what's interesting. We know black skinned folks were everywhere around the ancient Mediterranean world. In my dissertation, and I'll send this to you another time, Lisa, I think it's interesting. In Pompeii, you know about Pompeii. Pompeii is the place that was destroyed by it destroyed, and had some issues because of, I believe, Mount Vesuvius. So if I'm wrong on that, forgive me, but I believe that's what happened. Anyway, but the ancient city of Pompeii is important in the study of ancient physiognomy because you have images in ancient Pompeii of Ethiopians. Now, Pompeii is nowhere near Ethiopia, and yet we have Ethiopian images there. You can go to many places around the ancient Mediterranean where you have Ethiopians because black folk, and here's my point, black folk were everywhere. That's my point. You had black folks in Greece, you had black folks in Italy, you had black folks, you had black folks everywhere, right? Because these people traded, and these societies were more intermingled. And so I believe we had black people in Acts chapter 13 in Antioch of Syria, and they were a part of the group that sent Paul and Barnabas off to their mission. And so I think that's important because we need to understand, again, that from the very genesis of the Christian church, at its very foundation, we had Black people involved. This was not a white man's religion. It never was. I mean, it's just that's a silly thing to say. It's really almost, and it borders on anti-Semitic, really, because Jews are the foundation of the Christian gospel. God used Israel, and the peoples who were part of Israel, which and you know this, they came out of Egypt, and there were Ethiopians in Israel. There were people, all kinds of African people who were connected to Israel. And you read the Old Testament, you can't read the Old Testament and not see that God has always loved and desired and had a relationship with Israel and Ethiopia and Egypt in some way. And so it's not a surprise then that when you get to the New Testament, you got people from Ethiopia and Egypt and so forth, African people, who are part of the initial, the founding of the church. It's not a surprise. And so I think that's absolutely fundamental to recognize that these debates are really the way they are, Lisa, because we don't know our history. And so we're saying stuff out of ignorance. And I'm not trying to be mean, but we're saying stuff because we just don't know. We have to make stuff up because we don't know what's real and what's really going on. And so if we actually read the text for what it says, do historical exegesis, we don't have to put nothing in there. Just do historical exegesis. We'll discover that these texts bear out that from the beginning, God has always concerned himself with Black-skinned people and that we're valuable to him.
And that's awesome and helpful. What resources would you recommend for those who want to study more on this topic?
So I would definitely recommend. So I'm doing some research that is interesting, but I recommend. My research is going to be kind of new in a lot of ways because a lot of scholarship doesn't cover this. But Clarice Martin wrote her dissertation many years ago on the Ethiopian eunuch, and I think that's Dr. Martin did an excellent job. Her thesis was very important on this. I would say Dr. Sadler's book on Cush, Cushites in the Bible. I would also recommend Dwight McKissick's book, Pastor McKissick's book on Black Beyond Roots, Black Presence in the Bible, and Greg Keener's commentary on the Book of Acts is also important. He gives a lot of ancient resources and other material that you should use. Ben Witherington's commentary on the Book of Acts as well. And there are other books. And so if readers would like a bibliography, I would certainly be willing to compile one. I'm using it myself, write my dissertation. So I have to have one. but yeah, so those books would be good books. Gabe Byron's book on symbolic blackness, I would recommend her book because it's just important. I mean, there may be some theological issues here and there with all these different books that people may have, but what's important, I think, with all of them, is that they give you a reference, a database of resources from which you can draw and discover a lot of helpful things and viewpoints about how the ancients viewed Blackness and why Blackness is important to God. So, yeah.
Thank you. That's helpful. How can people get in contact with you on social media?
So my Twitter handle is Rev M Jerkins, Marcus Jerkins. You can look me up on Twitter. My Facebook is Marcus Jerkins. You can look me up there. And anywhere you look for Marcus Jerkins, there's only a couple of us in all of America. Jerkins is a very uncommon name. So you look up Marcus Jerkins, you find a Marcus Jerkins on the internet. It's probably me. So yeah, but those two social media handles of mine should work. And if people want to reach me there, that's fine.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Marcus. I appreciate you for coming on the podcast. And remember, everybody who's listening, we have Courageous Conversations coming up August 1st and 2nd in Atlanta, Georgia at the Greater Piney Grove Baptist Church. We would love to see you there. We have 28 scholars, 7 different conversations like rethinking hell, what is sin, discerning truth. If you go to courageouscombos.org, you can see a full list and you can register. The early bird registration is till June 1st. So I encourage you to take advantage of that. Group registration will be up. And also we have room blocks available on the website as well. So I look forward to seeing you there. I know that last year we had a great time, and I'm expecting God to do even more for this year. Also, if you would like to be a partner with Jude 3 Project, we would greatly appreciate it. Anything you can give monthly, 5, 10, 15, 20, 10,000. If you're able to do that much, we would greatly appreciate it. Give at jude3project.com/donate. And remember, here at the Jude 3 Project, we're helping you know what you believe